Before I start, I just wanted to start with a personal reflection. As was mentioned before, I've moved here a couple of years ago. I'm Portuguese originally, and a month ago I was actually in New York speaking at Columbia University first for an alumni reunion of my own MBA, and then I was invited to go to New York University actually in a similar setting to talk about Portugal, my home country where I haven't lived for almost 20 years. And the parallels are very striking because Portugal has 10 million people. It has an economy around 200 billion US dollars. And when I actually moved here, I was looking at the numbers, and actually that was sort of the GDP of Hong Kong with 7 million people. But let me tell you, clearly the mood there just before the IMF and the European Union bailout of $111 billion was very different. And actually it was very interesting to look at what the future of Portugal could be within the euro and within the European economy, where there's probably 10 years of extraordinarily slow, if not regression in GDP, versus talking about here today the future of the Hong Kong economy and the link to Greater China. So one of the things you may have read in my CV, I used to be a consultant. I was a partner at McKinsey, and before that I was at Goldman Sachs. So as a consultant, I need to speak with slides. So what I'll try to do is to go over there to the podium and speak from there, because otherwise this will become really boring. So here we are. I'm also the banker, so I'll try to speak with some more figures. I'm also the one without the tie, which for a banker is quite impressive. So I'll try to speak. Fairly quickly, and then we'll open, I guess, for discussion later on. As a banker again and working for HSBC, I've worked for HSBC for 4 years. What I'm going to focus is more on the financial aspects, as you'd expect, of Hong Kong, but particularly the RMB internationalization and the role of Hong Kong as an offshore RMB center. I think that's very important. I think it's one of the issues maybe on discussion we can pick up on, and there's some of the more controversial issues around the evolution of the RMB. So let me start with the role of Hong Kong in terms of as a financial center for Greater China. I think 3 important points, and Professor Geno and myself were actually at the China Development Forum, I think 2 months ago, and at the presentation of the 12th five-year plan. And one of the things which is clear in that plan and generally is that Hong Kong, as China's central government, support as an offshore center for RMB. Many of the pilot programs like trade settlement that we as HSBC and other banks have supported, RMB deposits, everything else has been piloted here in Hong Kong. And clearly the role of Hong Kong as an offshore center for RMB cannot be overstated, generally for China, but for Hong Kong's development going forward. Actually, Hong Kong is not the only offshore center for RMB. If you go to Singapore, it is actually an offshore center for RMB. What's particular about Hong Kong is that it's the only center that actually has this sort of official sanctioning as sort of an offshore center. And the relationship between the HKMA and the PBOC, so the regulatory relationship, is very important. And in a market that's so regulatory controlled, I think that's the key differentiation for Hong Kong as an offshore center for RMB. So what I've tried to illustrate here is something that was actually mentioned before by the keynote speaker, is the 3 stages of internationalization of the RMB. So the first 2 have really already started. So RMB as a global trading currency, and a global trading settlement currency has started in 2009. And RMB as an investment currency has really started last year. And those 2 have picked up with extraordinary speed, as all of you know, living here. And I'll illustrate with some figures which are, I think, astonishing from a banking perspective. And then the last stage is actually RMB as a reserve currency. And I think if we look back to, I guess, the 15th, 14th century, etc., there's no period in history where a country becomes a major economic power without its currency becoming a reserve currency of the world. And so inevitably the RMB will be at least the 3rd most traded currency in the world, and that will come with convertibility. But regardless of that 3rd stage on the right, clearly RMB as a trading settlement currency and RMB as an investment currency, it's a reality today and will be a reality with us for the next years. And therefore, the role of Hong Kong as an offshore RMB center is very important, which is where I'll focus my remarks. And that's what this chart tries to illustrate, which is RMB becoming probably the third most traded currency globally, and the role of Hong Kong as an international financial center, and that link. So for the rest of the 4 slides I have, I'll focus on 4 aspects of that. One is deposits and all the development of deposits of RMB here in Hong Kong. Second, trade settlement, which is probably the most exciting one as it links to the topic of this panel in terms of the regional trade and the global trade and the role of Hong Kong. Third, debt capital markets that we've talked about a bit before, and then equity capital markets and some of the recent developments there. And I like to sort of show how the 4 elements are connected. So the deposits, the trade settlement, the debt issuance, the so-called dim sum bonds, and the equity capital markets are how all of those aspects are linked, and how Hong Kong can continue to play a critical role and actually develop in that way. Apologies if you can't read everything, but I'll show you some of the numbers that are on this chart. So the first element, as I said, is the deposit base. And I think here the numbers are really staggering. If you look at the left-hand side chart there, the numbers for March, which are not here, are around 450 billion RMB of deposits here in Hong Kong alone. Obviously, that's a small number when you compare it to the total RMB in the world. It's roughly 1% of well, less than 1% of what exists as RMB in mainland China. But if you think of the growth of that, we at HSBC expect around 1.2 trillion by the end of this year. So as we all know, as people living here, the accumulation of RMB, both from the company side but at the personal level, is astonishing, and we should come back to that in a second. A lot of that is actually linked to trade. So what you can see on the right-hand side chart is that, yes, a lot of the individuals, which is that red part of 80 billion, the residents putting cash in RMB is one of the elements, but the main part of it is really mainland China's companies and other international companies really accumulating RMB in Hong Kong. So I think that's the first part, which is the deposit side. Just to give you statistics from HSBC, our deposit base of RMB in Hong Kong has increased 4-fold. So it has increased 300% this year. So the amount of RMB deposits that we have within HSBC has increased by 4 times throughout this year. And so well, actually, by the end of this year, it will have increased 4 times. So that gives you a scale of the amount of RMB that actually is being used in the economy in Hong Kong, and how that continues to increase going forward. That creates a small problem, which is more of a technical problem, but I would like to highlight, which is there's only one clearing bank for RMB in Hong Kong, which is Bank of China. So all of the other banks have a huge exposure to Bank of China, because basically what we do is we take all of your deposits in RMB, and because we can't use them for anything else, we basically deposit them with Bank of China. So there is quite a lot of cross exposure between banks, which is something that for us bankers worries us a lot, because the more this grows, the more we have exposure to Bank of China particularly. And one of the things we've said publicly is that we think that other banks should have a clearing status in terms of RMB in Hong Kong, obviously ourselves being one of them. Yeah. But it is something, as we think of the liberalization of RMB and eventually the full convertibility, we believe that more banks need to be able to clear RMB in the same way that we and other banks clear the Hong Kong dollar. So that's the first point, which is deposits. The second one, which is linked directly to that, and it's actually more exciting, is the trade settlement side. You can see some of the figures on that chart. You can just see the red bar basically increasing, and the number you have there at the end of 2010 is above 500 billion of renminbi in terms of settlement. Just to give you a sense of the scale, we project that by 2015 there will be 6 trillion. The trade of China with the rest of the world will be $6 trillion US. So that's $6 trillion US. So if you think of that number, that's all of the trade that China does with the rest of the world, 6 trillion. That's a growth in trade of around 18% every year. So if you think of the growth of that. Of that 6 trillion, our projections are that a third will be done in RMB. So that gives you the sense of, and today is less than 10%. So if not only the trade will continue to grow, and some of us are more bullish or more bearish in terms of the development of the mainland Chinese economy, but the secular trend is there. So the number will be around 6 trillion. A third of that will be in RMB. So if a third of that is in RMB, immediately the RMB becomes the third most traded currency globally. so after the US dollar and the euro. So clearly that trend, and we can adjust the numbers up or down, is an unavoidable trend, and therefore the role of Hong Kong, again, as an offshore RMB center is very important. To give you an HSBC statistic, we currently settle, we are in 87 countries, and we settle RMB trade in 45 of those countries. So that was for us 45 billion RMB last year. So it gives you already, this is happening today, and what I think most people don't realize, clearly outside Hong Kong, but even in Hong Kong, is how quickly this has evolved over the last few months. So there was zero trade done through HSBC a year ago. So these numbers were, over the last year, the number of Vietnamese companies, the number of Singaporean companies, the number of Brazilian companies that are no longer settling trades with China in US dollars, but they're settling it in renminbi, despite the fact that the renminbi is not fully convertible, is astonishing. And I think the growth of this market is a key development. So the third aspect is then debt capital markets. And in a way, as I said, I think all of these aspects are connected. The fact that we have a lot of accumulation of RMB in Hong Kong, and the fact that you can't really deploy it in almost anything, has also created a lot of supply, or a lot of supply of RMB in Hong Kong that can then be deployed in debt capital markets. And that's actually, as mentioned earlier, a lot of mainland Chinese companies that found it much cheaper to finance themselves through the debt capital market issuance here in Hong Kong than to do it in the mainland. And progressively more and more international companies are doing that. So you see Unilever has issued debt here last year. The World Bank has actually done an issuance. So there is a lot of what are called dim sum bonds, so issuance of either mainland Chinese, Hong Kong, or international companies in Hong Kong, in RMB. That is a sort of, again, a booming market. And you can see the statistics. The statistics there, we project around 60 billion for this year, which is the dotted bar over there by the end of this year, which will bring the total outstanding debt issued to 100 billion RMB by the end of this year, which is, again, these numbers are reasonably small for the large sort of capital markets. What I think is very interesting is the growth rate. And if you start projecting how all of these markets will grow, it makes for a very exciting story. And the cost of issuing that debt, as also was mentioned before, is actually cheaper in many cases than in the mainland or in other markets. Part of that is the expectation of the appreciation of the RMB, and so therefore, in many cases, that has been cheaper. But in some cases, it's just the fact that there's so much supply of RMB. So that's the third part, and then the fourth one, and my last comment, is around the equity capital markets. Obviously, as also was pointed out by the keynote speaker, Hong Kong has been the #1 IPO market in the world. And what's interesting is actually disagreeing a bit with the previous speaker is that obviously a lot of those are mainland Chinese companies. What that graph shows is that 50% are mainland Chinese companies actually IPOing in Hong Kong. But there's also 45% of that which is international companies. So if you look at the numbers this year, obviously you have AIA, which you'd consider a Hong Kong company, but you have L'Occitane from France, which did a very successful IPO recently. You have the first RMB IPO, which was the Shang Kong real estate investment trust that was done in April of this year, and that was $1.6 billion US. So there's more and more sort of local, Hong Kong local, and international issuance of equity in Hong Kong, and in some cases now also both in Hong Kong dollars and RMB. So again, I think there is an exciting market there. So just in conclusion, I think these four elements, which are the deposits of RMB in Hong Kong, the trade settlement, which I think is the most exciting trend, equity and debt capital markets, all of those factors coming together, I think will reinforce the role of Hong Kong as the international financial center for mainland China and for the growth of the mainland. And one personal reflection again, when I worked at Goldman Sachs, at some point there was a view that we were all going to move to Frankfurt. I lived in London for 10 years. And everybody was trying to convince us to move to Frankfurt because with the euro coming, there was the idea that the euro was come, we all had to move to Frankfurt. And obviously Frankfurt is a dreadful city if you've ever been to Frankfurt. I had just graduated from Columbia, and I was in London, and the last thing I wanted was to go to Frankfurt, so I left Goldman Sachs and joined McKinsey. But apart from that, at that point there was the sense that really with the strength of the European Union, which seems ironic now, and the fact that the euro was going to become, was going to rival the US dollar, and in fact has become the second most important currency globally, that we all had to move outside the UK because the UK had not joined the euro. And really at that point the euro-dollar market, and particularly the euro market in London, started to develop, and the role of all of the continental European bankers that actually stayed in London and made London the success that it is today, I think there's exactly that parallel for Hong Kong, and how Hong Kong can continue to play and actually grow as the RMB offshore center, and actually continue through the convertibility, and actually there will be some tensions over the next years to make sure that growth and that dynamism is felt here in Hong Kong, and that Hong Kong continues to maintain its role as this vibrant international financial center. So that was really the end of my comments. Thank you.
Thank you so much.